Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hi, everyone. It is so nice to be able to talk to you this week. It is also really exciting to be able to share with you that we had listeners from all over the world during the last few weeks. I'm always so fascinated. So if you are listening from any of these places, please be in touch and let us know what draws you to the podcast. In places like Mexico and Russia, Poland, Finland, and Estonia. I have an interesting link to Estonia. I know that there were a number of Jews who lived there, a small community that were destroyed, deported, killed by the Nazis and Nazi sympathizers during World War II. The Roma also had a very bad fate in Estonia. It is also a very beautiful place, which I've seen in photos, and it was brought to my attention as an interesting part of the world in my own family history with a distant ancestor, a woman whose name was Regina, and she was from Tallinn in Harjumaa, Estonia. And it is so exciting to see Estonia on the list of places where people listen to the podcast. And now, for our guest today, we have Tiffany Yecke Brooks. She is the author of the new book, Holy Ghosted: Spiritual Anxiety, Religious Trauma, and the Language of Abuse, which equips readers to understand and name tactics of spiritual abuse and manipulation. Each chapter covers a different method of control found in toxic religious communities, including legalism, indoctrination, praise, and fear, and how to identify and respond to it healthily. Tiffany is the lead or contributing author on more than 24 books, including Gaslighted by God, Reconstructing a Disillusioned Faith. A popular speaker for student groups and faith conferences and academic lectureships, Brooks holds a Ph.D. in American and Dramatic Literature from Florida State University. Here she is now. I am so looking forward to speaking to Tiffany Yecke Brooks today because there are so many subjects for us to go over together, and you've been such a prolific writer and ghostwriter. Ghost seems to be a word that you're coming back to in different contexts.
Yes.
And so I would love for you to take a few moments to introduce yourself, and then we'll get started talking.
Sure. Okay. Well, hi. Yeah. I trained as a literature and writing professor, but I married into the military. And so as you move around the country, teaching jobs are kind of difficult. So I ended up transitioning into working in publishing. And I worked as a ghostwriter for 14 years. And then about 5 years ago, I stepped out on my own and started publishing under my own name. And so actually, as we get into the book, you'll see some of those vestiges of being a language person, a literature person, really work their way into the way I break down some of these issues that we look at. But I was raised in what I like to call sort of a fundamentalist, evangelical, weird chimera hybrid thing. And I for a long time, I didn't question because, a fish doesn't ask what's water. And so, we choke down that cognitive dissonance because we are raised to be the good little soldiers. But I started my deconstruction process around 2009, 2010, and didn't really have the language for it at the time, and really wrestled with a lot of those issues. Any literature out at that time was all sort of in the vein of, well, you just need to pray more. Something's wrong with you if your experience doesn't line up. Squeeze a little more Jesus on the situation and it'll all be better. And obviously that mindset was not cutting it anymore. And so that was the sort of the origin story of my first book, which is called Gaslighted by God, Reconstructing a Disillusioned Faith. And then out of that book, I had a chapter that looked at spiritual abuse and anxiety. And that was the impetus for my new book, Holy Ghosted.
I think about how many times I talk about language, parsing, just the different meanings, the other ways of kind of saying things, interpreting things. I'm sure it is a really good tool. And also, to a great degree, I think can be a safety net because you can kind of see what someone's up to by labeling it as such. It's like when people learn about journalism and they learn about the heading and how much it already sways the reader before they've even read the article, heard the interview. And so just the tone and language, I think so much of what I come across too in my work is this idea that if you're stating facts, you are somehow being a heathen, or if you're stating facts, you're being negative and you're doubting, and that's going to keep you from blah, blah, blah. But really, you're just saying this is what is, and this is what is true. And if someone doesn't want to hear it, then they're going to call it a lot of negative things and then put it back on you that you're doing something wrong. And in those moments, they're really making a statement about themselves and what they can handle. And they're not, even though it sounds like a statement about you. So that, yes, I think just kind of untangling all of that has probably, been just this lifeline for you of clarity, right?
Absolutely. That the writing process has been incredibly healing because, some of these things I would sit down and kind of start with an idea of like, I don't know what I want to say about this. I just know that it's an issue. And as I work through it, it forced me to have to do, because when something's uncomfortable or hard or whatever, we tend to maybe veer away from that into something that's a little more comfortable or a little easier, And so this actually forced me to have to sit down and parse out really what's going on here and why this matters and think about this in all of its little individual piece parts to understand, and I make very clear in the book that this is not an exhaustive book. I'm certainly not highlighting every technique that's used. I'm not, citing all the different examples that could possibly be out there. But one of the things I want to make clear to people is, first of all, kind of that Rumpelstiltskin effect, that once you have the name of something, once you can give it that label, it loses some of that power. It's no longer that ghost rattling chains in the closet. Now you know what it is and you can call it out. But also, I think it's important and woven throughout the book, there are stories that people shared with me about their own experiences, and some are really dramatic and some are much more subtle. And that was on purpose because I think a lot of times we hear a loaded word like abuse. The subtitle of the book is Spiritual Anxiety, Religious Trauma, and the Language of Abuse. So we hear that and people think, oh, well, I know what abuse looks like. And it is X, whatever working definition you have, without realizing that, yes, there can be overt abuse, but sometimes the most nefarious abuse is the really subtle stuff that you may not even recognize is going on in terms of the manipulation and the control and all of these things that you've never thought to question or to identify with those words. Because we have, the words have their connotations. We have the ideas attached to them of this is what abuse looks like. To me, it was important to make sure that the reader in reading the story, there would be some really blatant examples of anybody could look at that and clearly say this is abuse. And then there are some more subtle ones that somebody might say, oh, something like that happened to me. And I never really thought of that as abuse. But that is what was happening. That is what was going on.
Right. Yeah. It's incredible too. I remember when I became a teacher and then a therapist, and I remember hearing the same thing over and over. And it really, because in my education program and sometimes in counseling program, there was some overlap. And I remember hearing about abuse, and that abuse isn't just abuse. Abuse is also endangerment, and abuse is also neglect. And I thought abuse can be something you haven't done for someone, you haven't provided, when you haven't cared, you haven't protected. And I didn't know it could come in that passive form too, but it's just as important and just as harmful. And it's the same thing, in so many of these situations with abuse, I think also where people are not given the word, so they don't know it happen to them. And I think that's why it's so underreported in these, or they feel deserving of it. I would love to hear about your story. But first, I guess I want to jump in with what you just brought up about the kind of overt signs, but also the subtle signs that people might not know to recognize. What have you found?
So one of the chapters in my book that was really the most revealing to me as I worked on it was the idea of control through praise. And that this is such a big deal, especially in religious environments where we are raised to want to be people pleasers. And there's this idea of the more you do, then that is where your value comes from. And that's what makes you worthy of love. Or the more devotion you show, the more self-sacrificial you are, the more you exhaust yourself or even exploit yourself on behalf of others, especially on behalf of authority figures, the more you're praised. And you're even held up as an example of this is what we should all be doing. And what that does is it just kind of turns that screw in the person's head of if they believe I am only worthy of love or respect or anything because of what I do, then the more I'm praised for that, the more I'm going to keep repeating the pattern, even though it's the very thing that is destroying me, that's burning me out, that's putting me into this place of abuse and this deep spiritual anxiety. And that's one of the framing ideas that I use in the book is looking at what spiritual anxiety is and understanding that it is a trauma response. Please don't get me wrong. There's a huge need for healthy discussions about mental health and the church. Like that's very, very important. But spiritual anxiety originates in our environment, not in our neurological wiring. And there can be conditions that can exacerbate it, generalized anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, neurodivergence, different things can, emphasize it or make it present more in certain ways. But it's a learned behavior. No 8-year-old wakes up with some fully formed theology of hell out of nowhere, unless they've been taught there is a God who can judge your soul and reject you on an eternal level. And this is what, these are teachings, these are beliefs that we have gotten from somewhere external. And so that's really important. And I'm writing this as somebody who struggled with spiritual anxiety my entire life, but also had obsessive compulsive disorder. And so I can see, I know very clearly how the one can influence the other, but also how they are separate, that my OCD was also, yes, it touched my spiritual anxiety, but my spiritual anxiety came about because of what environment I was in, what theologies were being taught to me, what ideas I was being fed. And so that's something that I really want to emphasize to the readers, that if this is something you struggle with, it is not your fault, because that is such a big point in churches. Is often it's the idea of, well, if you have anxiety over your salvation or rejection or whatever it is, that's your fault. Then you clearly don't understand the love of God, or you are not saved, or whatever that goes back on you. And then we internalize that. And as people who have been raised in high control or authoritarian environments, again, it goes back to that people pleasing and that idea of wanting, okay, so if that's the framework I'm given, if that's the reality that has been mitigated for me, like this is you are my arbitrator of reality and you're telling me this is real. If I question it, and I don't say this lightly, but it can feel crazy making. Like you can feel insane because now you're questioning reality, because you are stepping outside of what you've been told is real and you're questioning authority. Sorry, that was a really long answer to what you asked. But I think all of these forces are at work in the way the abuse happens and the way that the spiritual anxiety presents as a trauma response to this kind of teaching and environment.
Oh my goodness, right. My mind just went so many different places because, yes, you're right. It taps into so many things. Going to the people pleasing, I recently gave a talk at a conference about why people say yes when they needed to say no. And some of it was about that they are wired to be people pleasing and to be too anxious about what will happen if they don't people please. But it also is something I remember, and I've talked about this on the podcast just a little and a while ago, about the McMartin trial and the case years ago about this preschool that was in a home. It was during the whole scare of repressed memories mean that there was, this whole satanic ritual abuse. So there was a story that came out about something happening within that McMartin preschool where the kids were being taken in underground tunnels and all of these things were being done to them. And a lot of the family went to jail, but then they found out none of it had happened. And so, how did this happen that these kids, little kids, were saying, oh, yes, this happened to me? We've learned a lot about how to interview children, especially from this case where they were people pleasing. The social workers and others would look disappointed because they had a job to do, right? They had data to collect. And they looked disappointed in these kids if they said nothing happened to me. And they would say, but maybe it did. And then the social worker would smile, like, oh, good. And they just went with the story that they remember hearing their parents say at home, and it made everyone happy with them. And so we will do a lot and sometimes even convince ourselves, because some of these kids grew up, because we can give ourselves, memories that of things that didn't happen. They thought that these things did happen to them, and they needed to realize they were part of kind of a manipulative system unwittingly, which was very interesting to find out about.
That is such a good point. And I think that that's something that really needs to be spoken about more, because we all know fight or flight. And sometimes, we discuss fight, flight, or freeze, but there's actually a fourth. It's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And that sometimes that a desire to appease the abuser becomes in itself a survival technique. And so going back to this idea of spiritual anxiety being a trauma response, that a trauma response arises when we have a biological response that was designed to keep us alive in the short term, but that then becomes our baseline. And so that adaptive behavior that was only ever meant to be something temporary now becomes a permanent condition. And so we're always trapped into this place of being on alert. And so our brain is constantly looking at, do I fight here? Do I run away? Do I, just kind of freeze and hope they don't see me? Do I, disappear in the background? Or do I try to appease the threat? And that's where that people pleasing feeds into this desire. And so with spiritual anxiety, we see that coming out really strongly. So there are, I look at things like, fear of shame and rejection and all these other things, but the issue of praise is the one that, to me, as somebody who grew up as the good little church girl, that really spoke to my experience in a way that surprised me once I really got into it and started looking at the way that manipulation really happens with our language and the way these things are presented and discussed.
Right. And there's also this idea about OCD being used and lauded, I think, within certain cultic groups and churches. And I think about a client I had a couple of years ago who had gotten involved in Orthodox Judaism, and her parents wanted her to leave it, to not be involved in something that was that traditional and that rule-based, because then she was no longer able to eat at the home of her parents and really join in family things, and they were missing her. And she didn't want to leave it for a lot of reasons. It was her choice, but also she said she had OCD, and in the world outside, that was a problem. But within Orthodoxy, it was praised, and she was seen as such a wonderful fill in the blank of the religion, right? A Jew, whatever else, because it mattered to her, let's say, keeping kosher. So meat and milk can't be, in the same meal. So it would matter to her to keep the cabinets with the meat dishes closed while she was making a milk meal, just in case a molecule of one touched the other. And she would think to that degree of specificity. And within her community, that was fantastic. But outside, it took her forever to do things, right? And everything was on the A list, and she was anxious. And as you know, right, it just feels like everything matters. And so she had kind of found her niche in a way, which was interesting.
That is a really interesting perspective. I actually have a chapter in Holy Ghost that I call involuntary internalized legalism. Legalism, when we talk about it, from a religious sense, it's ultimately about control. It's about either controlling the behavior of others or controlling God. Because if I do this, like if I get the extra credit, then God is obliged to, and, I say this as somebody who loves gold stars, so I'm like, guilty. I'm very guilty of this. But, if I do this extra thing, then God is now obliged to repay me with blessings. What I call involuntary internalized legalism is when we turn that legalism to ourselves. And so we may not put those burdens on the other person the way sort of normal legalism would, but we put it on ourselves. And first of all, I look at legalism and say, it works one of two ways. Either it's kind of that slippery slope mentality of, well, if A leads to B and B leads to C, then A inevitably leads down to Z. But it can also be, we can view it as like a Rube Goldberg device, which is the thing where it's like a dart pops a balloon, which triggers a domino, which hits a boot, which makes a, ping pong ball go, which then your toast appears or whatever. Those are kind of the two ways that we can think about how legalism works. And so this involuntary internalized legalism is something that like the person knows this is irrational. They know I feel like I'm going too far. And yet, because I've been taught, pray continually, or, any sin is an abomination to God and will keep you from God's presence, whatever that is, I still feel obliged. And so it gets to the point where you become imprisoned by your own conscience. And then you can't trust your own brain. And the thing is, and I want to be clear, and I say this in the book as well, not every church is like this. Not every religious system is like this. Not every religious leader is twirling their mustache and tying souls onto celestial railroad tracks. Like, that's not what I'm trying to imply here. But we know that there are high control environments and authoritarian churches that people are in. And so when I talk about church leaders, also, I want to be clear, sorry, I'm backtracking a little bit, but this can be a pastor, but it can be a family member. This can be anyone who is asserting some kind of religious authority over someone else. So that's something important to remember too, because you might say, well, my preacher never did that. Okay, but did a parent, or did a teacher? And so it's important to think about where this abuse happens and so pivoting back to this idea, so many faith traditions have the chronic practice of shaming the intuition out of people. Because you are taught you can't, and I've heard preachers say this, radio preachers, people in pulpits, you cannot trust your emotions. You can only trust the Bible. That trusting your feelings that's trusting in the flesh. And so one of the major points that I try to make in the book is that it is not a sin to listen to your intuition. You will not go to hell for trying to protect yourself or someone else from exploitation or abuse. Like we need that message needs to be driven home and I think especially for women, that intuition is shamed out of us. That drives us further into this state of anxiety because suddenly it's like, I can't trust my gut because that's trusting in the flesh, or I can't trust my feelings or my spidey senses or listen to the heebie-jeebies that I'm getting, whatever you want to say. And that makes a person ripe for abuse. And so, it's like, well, no, you have to look at what the Bible says, but it's always what I am telling you what the Bible says. And so then you get into issues of literalism and all of that. So I try to tackle, again, as much as possible in this book to help people who are coming out of these environments, because when that's been your only metric and you've been taught that every decision carries eternal consequences, it's really hard to pull yourself out of that constant state of being on alert, feeling like a prey animal at all times, and learning how to step back, remove yourself from that, because we were not created to exist in a place of perpetual mental torment. Like that's not how we were designed to work. And so, yeah, that's that idea of involuntary internalized legalism, where you can even recognize this probably isn't logical. This probably doesn't make sense, but I can't stop myself from doing it because what if? because I've been taught every single decision could impact my eternity. What do you do then?
Right. What if? Oh my goodness. The what ifs. I don't know if they're two more controlling words in our brains, right?
Mm-hmm.
What if? My goodness, it guides a lot of the decisions that we make, a lot of the worried decisions that we make, the ones that are tied in with catastrophizing, really. What if a bad thing will happen? Or what if we don't do this or do this and a bad thing will happen? It always somehow goes to something bad. So I'm curious about your experiences. And I know that there are many, and so it's sort of hard to consolidate. But if we can get a flavor for your life when you were growing up and what it was like for you, and also why you left it.
I grew up in a loving home, and my church was relatively normal. Like, we were not super weird like, you're not going to see us on 60 Minutes, like in most. But I also grew up in my teenage years were in the 90s, just south of Washington, D.C. So that was kind of Colorado Springs East at the time. Like, every evangelical movement would come through DC at that time. And so, these messages were just in the soup of what Christianity is. And as somebody who very much cared about doing things the right way, that was a really scary way to be, because also, there were messages of Y2K and is the rapture going to happen? And all of these, messages that we're all being bombarded with, that for somebody who already had sort of a busy brain, it was difficult to turn that off. And so everything, I talk about in the book that, I was a cheerleader, and I'd be at the football game, and suddenly, in the middle of a cheer, I'd just be like, oh my gosh, but God, please forgive me for any sin that I have committed, because what if the world ends right now? And so it's, again, that idea. And like I said, I don't say it lightly, but that idea of crazy making, where you just feel like it interferes with your ability to actually live, because I'd heard the scripture of pray continually. And so, maybe you're in a movie and somebody swears too much and suddenly you can't watch it because you have to pray, I'm sorry, I put this unholy thing before my eyes, because we're taught to memorize scripture, but it's usually taken out of context. And it's these highly controlling passages. And that's something I do in the book, is I look at some of these passages that are used to extract obedience from people and say, is that really what the story is about? And if it is, what does that say about our Bible and the way we view our Bible? And should we not be able to raise questions and say, this seems problematic? Like, it's almost like we've stripped human decency from the equation in an effort, because we've confused obedience with love. So to define what I mean by spiritual anxiety, it's not things like healthy religious devotion or normal feelings of regret or repentance. And it's not an attempt to just deny the reality of sin or anything like that, but it's things like obsessive fears of angering God through intentional or unintentional sin, or deep doubts about your worthiness of love or care, constant feelings of failing at living a good, faithful life, or faith responses rooted in fear, those sorts of things. And it can present like unwelcome, intrusive religious thoughts, pervasive doubt about your own salvation, perfectionism. Aggressive evangelism is a big one, because if you think, I've missed the mark here, I've screwed up, I'm not quite where I should be, the way I get back to it is I go out and pull someone else in and say, hey, do you know, and so then I get really aggressive. And also because if I believe that my way of being is the only one that's right, then evangelism has to be aggressive, because I have to be convincing everyone else to my rightness. And I'm using air quotes for people who are listening to this, because it's that idea of the absolutism of you. You have to be, this is the only way. And that idea, that indoctrination. But you can also have compulsive praying and negative self-talk. And all of these things can come together to create this place of imbalance, emotional imbalance, where you're never sure if you can trust yourself. You're always, feeling that such a worm as I theology, that you're never good enough, you never measure up. And some people, you don't even see it because they're really good at masking it. But the problem is that somebody who's in that state who feels that they can't trust themselves is a whole lot easier to manipulate, because then you can say, yeah, you can't trust yourself, but you can trust me. I'm your godly counsel. I'm the person who will tell you what the scriptures mean. I will, whatever. And it sets people up, it primes them to be victims of abuse.
Hmm. Right. And I wonder then about these unwelcome and intrusive thoughts. So, can you describe, and I know some of them were tied in with some of the fears, the what ifs and all of that, that you had mentioned. What are some of the other ones that you've come across a lot, and maybe even for yourself? And then what to do, how to respond to them, what helps to potentially diffuse them? Because I feel like sometimes people need to add in a way to dialogue with them so that you can undo them. But so what are some of these thoughts as you're seeing or you experience them yourself?
Well, I love that you brought that up, because I had a good laugh with someone, a conversation I had recently where we were talking about this. And as women who grew up steeped in purity culture, she said, I would occasionally have like a sexual thought where I'd just be like, she'd said like, oh my gosh, I just thought about a penis. I'm going to hell. But when you're constantly being bombarded with, don't think of sex, what are you going to do? Like and so then how do you deal with that, especially when you're like a teenager? And this is the message that you're getting, and it's steeped in this guilt and shame and everything else. So one of the techniques that I've found that I think is important to think about is, in a lot of popular psychology right now, we hear the difference between shame and guilt. That shame is the idea of something is wrong with me, and guilt is the idea that I did something wrong. So it separates it. That doesn't work in most religious settings, however, because we've been taught that what we do is a direct result of who we are and what the state of our heart is. And so you can't say, well, I can think about this as, rather than I'll reject the shame, but I'll accept the guilt. Like, I did something wrong, but that doesn't mean I'm a bad person. In religious circles, the way it's usually spoken about is, well, we shall know them by their fruit. Well, if your fruit is bad, if you have done something bad, that means that you are bad. And so that separation, as helpful as it is in a lot of secular circles, it is not always helpful for people coming out of religious environments, because that distinction doesn't exist. So what I encourage people to do is just to turn to the second thought. So I know I always struggled with the idea of, if you hit your hand with a hammer and you let out a swear word or something, I was always taught, that just shows the outpourings of your heart, because you didn't even have a chance to think about it and apply a filter. So whatever came out, that shows what rottenness is in your heart. But that's the lizard brain. That's the knee-jerk part of you that is just reflexive, that just spits out whatever is there. Who you are really is determined by your choices. So what's your second thought? Once you've gotten whatever you had to say out of your system when you hit your thumb with the hammer, or let's say, you see someone and you have, say, a lustful thought, and then you're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm this horrible person. I've sinned that was your need. That was your biological response. But what is your mammalian brain? What is your higher thinking? Once you actually stop and make a conscious decision, you can say, oh, but that person looks like they're having a lovely lunch with friends. Good for them. Or, oh, and what a lovely outfit they have on. Whatever that is, if you can choose to make that pivot to that second thought and have that second thought be something that is healthy and non-objectifying, or what, that can create that separation between who I am and what I do, because it is the choice that you are making. And that when you are given the option, you have decided that you're going to choose not to objectify the person. You've decided to take the better path. And so that's one technique that I think is really helpful for just thinking about these things in practical ways.
Right. There's an interesting thing in that, which is that you can then do something that makes you feel bad about yourself, and then you're worried that means something about you. And then the consistent worry that you have then causes more intrusive thoughts. And it probably also has you make conclusions about certain things that are false because it kind of underscores what you're worried about and what you think about yourself. And so it's just a rabbit hole.
Absolutely. Yeah. It becomes a kind of like self-affirming, self-fulfilling prophecy almost, because it is. And I talk about that in the book too, about the cycle of I'm not living my life right. That is because thus and so is wrong. If I do this, that makes it worse because I'm not living my life right, And so it just becomes this vicious cycle of self-condemnation over and over again. And again, a person who is in that place of disregarding themselves or discounting themselves or seeing themselves as, a worthless worm is primed to then be controlled by someone else who says, but I have the answer. I have the way out. But the way out usually is just leaning into the cycle. And again, that's that idea of when somebody establishes themselves as the arbitrator of your reality, it then means if you question their reality, you're questioning reality in general. So now you're the crazy one. So it's the system feeds the system protects the system.
Right. And as you were talking also about how you are basically your misdeeds, you are that, then you haven't sinned, you are a sinner, and whatever else. It becomes you. I think about the thing that you're taught to say to kids that is important that I guess does not apply here, doesn't fit, where when a child might do something that they're not supposed to do or that makes you disappointed in some way, you're supposed to say, I am not angry with you. I am upset about what you did. Like your whole person is still something that I love and I see as good and I see has the potential. But let's just kind of narrow it down and isolate this action and look at it and see if that's something that you can shift the next time. But you're saying in these environments, you are that. And then I don't know how you get out of that, right? Because are you then under suspicion forever because you've been seen that way?
So I think that is a great and healthy technique. And, I use that with my daughter as well of like, let's talk about the choices you made. But also like we need to remember as adults, we have the ability to be nuanced thinkers. And we know that the research has shown that often people's maturity stops at the point at which they were traumatized, and so that it can be hard sometimes. The thinking can be stunted or more immature sometimes as adults because of what we have experienced. So I'd say like that's a good way to break it down for children who do operate more in sort of a black and white binary way of understanding the world until, they're able to get into more abstract thought. But as adults, we can then say, okay, why did you make this choice? And then, and so get into like understanding motives and kind of looking at ourselves of, oh, well, I didn't, I really wasn't thinking, or well, I chose it because of. And so if we can get to the why under that, then again, it's that idea of you can create a bit of a separation rather than just this idea of everything you do is a result of the fact that you are a filthy sinner who God can't stand the sight of.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Which is very heavy for a child, especially to have to carry around. My goodness. Right. How do you even make sense of that?
Right. Yes.
Okay. And so then I wonder also just about other intrusive thoughts, because you brought up a really interesting point that I'm now remembering a client who said to me that she was actually so surprised and so relieved that when she left her fundy upbringing, as she called it, she said, people don't talk about sex nearly as much as,
Right.
as I was raised with, where they kept telling you not to think about it. Same thing. Like, what? Like, don't think about an elephant. Don't push that red button. Well, like, I hadn't even thought about it until you mentioned it over and over again. And so I think it is really setting people up, and I also just wonder why it's on the leader's mind so often. Uh, right? It makes me kind of wonder. So, okay, yeah. So they're going to be intrusive thoughts about sex, about just thinking of body parts and wondering what that means about you. And what are some of the other intrusive and kind of unwelcome thoughts that you've come across?
Well, I mean, you can have even things like I mentioned with cheerleading, where if I stopped and then suddenly the thought occurred, I stopped praying. I was waving my pom poms at the crowd. And what if Jesus comes back in this, So sometimes it's just the idea of, oh, I've been lax in what I'm supposed to be always on duty for, like I'm supposed to always be watching. Or, it could even be, again, going to that idea of the second thought of like looking at someone and you can be like, ugh, what an ugly hairstyle. And you're like, oh my gosh, I just had a hateful thought towards this person. What can I do? And again, that idea of pivoting to that second thought of being like, oh, I hate that outfit. Okay, but you know what? It looks really comfortable, or they sure look happy wearing it, or whatever that is. So I had a really interesting experience when a few years ago, I was invited to an iftar dinner at our local mosque, and they were having sort of a community thing. And I was at a table with some other, like some female clergy, and they were talking about like preparing the meal. And they said, the hardest part is that last hour right before sundown, so our hosts were telling us about how that works. And they said the worst thing is like sometimes you'll be cooking and then you taste something like for salt or whatever, and suddenly you realize, oh my goodness, I just broke my fast. And so like then of course the thought was, oh my goodness, what do you do now? Like, do you have to redo your entire fast? Because you have to make up time. Like if you're breastfeeding and can't fast during Ramadan, then you have to make up another month. So like, how do you do that? Do you have to make up that fast? Like, how upsetting would that be if after 18 hours, And the woman just kind of laughed. She said, no. She said, we pause in that moment and we thank Allah for seeing us. And in that moment, Allah recognized that I needed that little bit to get me through the last hour. This wasn't something I chose. This was a blessing of provision that I was given, that I say thank you, and then I move on. And I don't take another spoonful, but like this wasn't a conscious decision that I made to disobey or to try to sneak something in. And that to me was such a massive shift in framework of, rather than saying like, because my mind immediately went to, and then you have to start all over because it's not perfect and that's not what God wants from you. But instead, this idea of, no, that was a blessing. And it got me through that moment, and I was thankful for it. And then I moved on. That sounds dreamy, to be that mentally and emotionally healthy. Tell me how you do that. So, but that was such a powerful lesson to me in just how much we allow these thoughts to control us. So that's not maybe an intrusive thought necessarily, but just that idea of the immediate self-condemnation that comes from something can be sometimes that immediate. It can be that intrusive thought of just being like, oh, you screwed up. Oh, you're such a mess. God's not happy with this anymore. You're no longer worthy of it. Just being like, oh, nope. Oops, I screwed up. Well, thanks for that bit of grace. I'm going to move forward now.
Right. I know I was just thinking of grace, and I was thinking, do you say Islamic grace? But that's sort of that was what came to mind. It is. It's like, here, this is a God, or this is a tradition, like you're saying, that sees the person, that also understands that they're people and understands their intention. That's a beautiful thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. And very different, right? There isn't some punitive action, and that none of what you did counts anymore, right? It's all erased, that whole thing.
Our genie fairy tale God who's been waiting to catch us in a loophole and trick us is snickering because now, ha ha ha, you have to start over again. It's not what that is.
No. Oh my goodness. Being given a chance to be treated respectfully in that way. And and I think also, seen as an adult or even as a child, but that you can do certain things and you can be human. That's allowed.
Absolutely.
My goodness. Yeah, that's different. Right. Okay. So that's a beautiful thing that you went to that as well. And I'm sure it was delicious. I'm wondering also about this aggressive evangelism that you brought up. And if you can talk about that. Yeah, I think, people who told me that they used to go door to door, or they were sent on missions to like Papua New Guinea, and they really thought it was on their shoulders to save people. So they were not going to drop it. They were going to be tireless, and they were going to be like kind of a dog on a bone, spiritually speaking, for other people's sake. But you're saying also that sometimes it can be that there's a need from that person to kind of tend to something that's happening internally for them. And that's why they're becoming aggressively evangelizing. So I'm just wondering about that and what you've seen.
Yeah, because if what you have sold your life to, sold out to, is not right, then everything is a waste. Then what does your life mean? And so sometimes if you struggle with doubt, that aggressive evangelizing is a way to soothe those fears, because you think, well, if somebody else believes it right, that it's right, then that's affirmation of my rightness. And so it can actually be weirdly a soothing behavior, because it's a moment where if you feel a little out of control because you're questioning or doubting, you've been reprimanded or whatever that is, if you do this something extra and you do it in a way that convinces other people, then that affirms to yourself that this thing that you have sold out to is right, and somebody else sees the reality that you've been given. And so then it feels like you have a little bit of control back, because now it's more comforting. I'm not alone. I'm doing the work. I'm doing the thing, and I'm doing it again. It's that I'm doing the extra credit. And so it's all okay. And so it actually placates some of those fears that we may have.
Right. And some of the cognitive dissonance.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay. So now getting into that kind of a subheading, I think maybe it's about something else, but I sort of see it as a subheading. With the people who, let's say, do conversion therapy for gays and lesbians, and then they are gay and lesbian themselves. That's not a judgment, and it's not anything. It's just to understand. I wonder if it's part of this. Like, if I can be part of this movement, I might be able to find a way to kind of convert myself out of it, because I've been made so uncomfortable to be it.
Absolutely. And you touched on this a bit at the beginning of our conversation, but something I talk about is that what we see being enforced, what we see being held up as absolute, tells us just as much about the anxieties of the people in authority as they do about anything else. This speaks to their fears and their worries and their insecurities and whatever that is. That's what's putting up those fences and gates and walls and everything else. And so, there are several things that I look at in the book where I'll say, like, this shows us, going back to the 4th century or whatever it is, this is revealing those cultural anxieties. And then this becomes the tradition, which I look at the rhetorical argument of, or the rhetorical fallacy of the argument from tradition of, well, we've always done it this way. So then tradition becomes dogma. And then it's like, well, but we've always done it this way. Okay, but maybe we've always been wrong. Have we considered that? And so sometimes these embedded fears or embedded agendas become so deeply ingrained that we no longer see them as something external that was projected onto a message, but we see them as being part of the message itself. I mean, one of the big things I do in the book is I reframe a number of Bible stories that I was always taught as a kid. This story means this. This is about this. And this is where kind of being that literature professor, comes in handy, is then I sit down and I look at the story. I'm like, does it though? Does it actually say that? And it's so interesting because one of the stories we look at is the Samaritan woman at the well with, she had the 5 husbands and Jesus is talking to her. And the way it was always presented in my churches growing up was like she was this ancient Elizabeth Taylor who just had this string of husbands who's getting married and divorced and married and divorced. You know how many times the word divorce is mentioned in that? 0. But we've been told what the story is about. And so we read it through that lens. But when we remove that lens, and I talk about, everyone has an agenda. People who say, oh, well, if you don't like this, take this up with God because it's God's word, not mine, are not acknowledging that, like, the most predominant lens that we're told is agendaless is, the white, cis, hetero, Anglo-Saxon male perspective. And that anything different from that is identity politics. Anything different from that is reading with an agenda, but that's not an agenda. So we need to acknowledge that, and that we all come to the text with an agenda, and like it's impossible not to. So like just acknowledge that from go. But then what is the agenda? Like, what have you been told this story means? So that there's some stories from the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures that I was always taught are about like, this is why absolute obedience is important. This is why we follow God's word to the letter. But when you get in there and you realize, actually, this story could be saying something completely different. Like this story, these were not average people. Like the story of Nahab and Abihu, and they offer strange fire in the temple and get consumed. And I was taught like, this is why. I grew up in a tradition that uses a cappella music, no instruments. And this story was often cited to see this is what happens when you add something to worship that's not supposed to be there. Except that story is actually about religious leaders who overstepped their boundaries of authority. So I was told it's about this is why we don't question. Whereas when I read it, I see, wait a minute, no, these are about people who are put in a position of authority and took their freedom too far. Same story, nothing's changed, but the message we take from that is totally different. But when we've been told this is what the story is about, we're generally going to read it with those preconceived bumpers in place that are going to steer our interpretation and understanding of it.
I think that's so important too when you talk about language and meaning and interpretation, that sometimes, and I think I mentioned this on the show, sometimes I can tell something is a more cult-like group because there's only one source of information. All the books are written by this one person or whatever, and you just get their interpretation of some text like, oh, the Bible, and that you're not supposed to refer to the Bible, and you're not supposed to see the translations from other languages. So that you can compare and contrast. And, people these days are not, scholars of cuneiform. So like it would still be a little hard
That's fair.
to read it, whatever. I didn't learn that in middle school. But I think it is really interesting to see how once it's siphoned, then I guess you want to consider the source. You want to see how it served them to interpret it that way. So I'm just wondering, as you explored language and saw other interpretations and other ways of viewing things and other ways that within the same religion and same tradition, they're going to see it differently, and within different churches too, I'm sure that it becomes also self-selected, the stories that are told versus the stories that aren't, or the part of the story that's told, right? So what have you noticed about that?
Well, I think it's really interesting because we talk about orthodoxy a lot, and that like the orthodoxy is like the right belief, but there's also orthopraxy, which is right behavior. And so it's a lot easier to control someone's behavior than it is to control their beliefs. And so where a lot of authoritarian leaders get worried is when they see someone start to question their interpretation of things and their belief of things. So I have one of the chapters in the book is control through indoctrination. And so when authoritarian leaders see someone starting to question the foundation upon which their whole system is built, their whole hierarchy that they're at the top of, they're going to lean into controlling behavior. Because that's easier to do than to control someone's belief, someone's inner thoughts, because you can't see that. You can fake belief better than you can fake behavior. The more you see someone crack down on behavior, the more you can generally sense that maybe they're afraid of the challenges to the authority. And so that's one way that I think you see some of this manipulation. But in terms of looking at language in general, I look at a number of rhetorical fallacies where, because again, going back to this idea of the leaders being the arbitrators of reality, where if they can lay out an argument to you that seems unassailable, it seems like, well, the way they said, like something doesn't feel right, but the way they said it is so absolute that I can't necessarily figure out how to disprove it or how to go against that. So I guess I have to agree and go along with it. So I break down like half a dozen different rhetorical fallacies in different situations and scenarios to say, this is what's going on when you hear this kind of rhetoric. Church marquees are a big thing for this. Like, we love the little zingers in the church marquees because that little sound bite just sounds so catchy. But really what we're doing is it's a straw man argument. I mean, you're reducing the other party's view to a caricature. So it's intellectually dishonest. It's stripping it down and making it, we're pretending that this is all it is, rather than acknowledging that there's a bigger viewpoint here and setting them up as the enemy. Or you can have the ad hominem attack, where they rather than attacking the issue, they're attacking the person to try to divert your attention. It's spiritual sleight of hand. And so that's another big thing. And unfortunately, a lot of these high authority, high control church leaders or religious leaders have been educated in this kind of technique to be told, like, this is something that will shut down questions. This is something that will stop people from challenging you. And something that I mentioned in the book, a story I share, was I was at a church and the preacher was sharing a lesson about how, because I come from a teetotaling tradition. And so he was sharing a lesson about how the Greek word oinos doesn't mean fermented drink. It only means grape juice. It could not possibly mean wine. So wine could not be permitted because, Jesus changed water into grape juice, and oinos only means wine. And this was in a class setting. And I was a graduate student in classics studying ancient Greek at the time. I raised my hand and I said, okay, I understand oinos can mean any liquid made from grapes. So it can mean grape juice. It can also mean wine. And we know that it can mean wine because what about this scripture where it says, do not be drunk with the wine of the Spirit, And so I was like, so clearly an oinos is used here and clearly it's tied to drunkenness. So like, what do you do with that? And he looks at me and he goes, so one drink is one drink drunk was an expression that was often used in my church, meaning like you couldn't have any alcohol because like the whole slippery. So he said, how many drinks does it take for you to get drunk? Which I'm like, weird because you're not answering my question. And I was still a good little church girl at that point. And I said, well, I don't know. I've never been drunk. And he paused and he looked like I hit him because what he was trying to do was trick me into an answer to say 3 drinks. He'd say, so you're a drunkard. So you're just, and then that would derail the entire argument. But me and my naivete just literally was like, I don't know. I don't drink. I don't. And then he just pivoted and went on somewhere else because he didn't have an argument after that point because he had been trained. This is how you shut down dissension, is embarrass the other person, make them look like a sinner and that we can't listen to anything they say. And then so they're actually taught these techniques as a way of shutting down discussion, which is heartbreaking because churches should be a place where we can bring questions, where we can talk about differences, where we can debate issues. But instead, so many of them have become places where doubt is the ultimate sin. And that we have to panic and freak out if somebody raises a question that challenges orthodoxy, that challenges our power structure, whatever that is, because dissension can't be allowed. And that terrifies authoritarian leaders because dissension then challenges their primacy.
Right. Yes. And so in that scenario in your class, there's so much at play there, including, I think that he got defensive and he didn't want to be corrected. He couldn't handle being wrong. If he were a confident person, then he could say, Tiffany, thank you so much. I wasn't aware of that. I will make sure to, change that as I teach this. Good to know. And no harm, no foul.
Or even just say, you know what? I'm going to research this further. Thanks for raising that. Like, you don't even have to accept it. You can just say, interesting. I'm going to look into that rather than immediately shutting it down.
Yes. And you're right. Having a technique to boomerang, to put it back on you and have you be then shamed in front of people because I think he felt shamed. I mean, it's so interesting. That's like not that I'm, diagnosing him, but that's also part of sort of the narcissistic injury, Like, I need to injure you back and then some, so you don't do this again. And I love that you just didn't give him any material because you're like, I don't know. Don't ask me. I have no idea how much it takes. I haven't done that. And so that's where it died, which is great. This is so great. But yeah, I'm sure that happens a lot, that when people do want to bring up a subject or they're noticing something is not accurate, it's not welcome to say it. Wow. That's very hard. I'm wondering just about that, if there have been times that you felt like you wanted to point something out, or you saw what happened to other people who pointed things out.
Yeah, it's interesting. One woman I interviewed for the book was a historian, constitutional law scholar, various things. And she said her preacher one time preached a sermon about the separation of church and state and the famous letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptists, and where the line separation of church and state first appears. And she said that, he read that and he said, but most people don't know that the letter goes on and it actually says thus and so, and then went on. And it was this whole thing that conveniently backed up, what he was saying, that, the two should be intertwined, Christian nationalism, blah, blah, blah. And she thought, that's weird. I've never heard of that before. So she went home, she researched it. She looked up the original letter on the Library of Congress website, to see everything, and then sent that information to her pastor and said, hey, not sure if you're aware, not sure what your source was. I just want to let you know that, that passage doesn't actually appear in this letter. She said crickets. And then a few months later on I think it was the 4th of July, he preached the same sermon again. And so at that point, it's just willful ignorance. It's a willful rejection of facts that don't fit your narrative, the narrative that keeps you in power, that puts forward your message, your agenda, your manipulation of people's beliefs. And she said, for her, that was the final straw, because she was like, if you are going to be so willfully ignorant as to deny basic facts, then why would I trust anything else that you're teaching? And so when we see leaders who set themselves up as the final authority and cannot accept correction, or have a meltdown if challenged, then that is such a strong sign that there are bigger issues at play. Because again, going back to that idea of it's revealing of their own anxieties and their fears and insecurities. And so to me, that was such a powerful example of she said, I literally went to the Library of Congress website and found this, and he didn't care because his agenda was more important to him than truth. And that's really where the problem is when you see that somebody's end goal, that somebody's agenda is more important than reality, and not the created reality, but reality, then you're in a dangerous situation. And that is a form of abuse, because that is willfully misinforming people for the sake of extracting obedience, compliance, whatever that is, a certain type of behavior from them.
Right, right. Oh, so interesting. Yeah. So obedience and compliance. I mean, that is something also that makes it very hard to sort of just be your own person and and really see also if you are giving obedience to someone or to something that deserves it too. I mean, it shouldn't just be a matter of form. And I think that happens, what people are made is, I think especially women are made to go along with things. They then will find themselves after they've left in a relationship with a very controlling person. They know how to be compliant, and they know how to be accommodating, and they know how to be silent about their own discomfort and what they want. And so I think just helping people learn about what can be true in a relationship, and that you can have a say, and that you have to listen to each other, or it would be nice if you listen to each other. I'm sure that's quite a learning curve after people leave.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we know that there are so many ways that scriptures can be weaponized to control people into those. A big one that a number of people brought up was a passage from 1 Corinthians, love keeps no record of wrongs. So if somebody tried to bring up somebody's poor behavior, in a family discussion or say, like, this was really what you did here, that was not okay. Well, love keeps no record of wrong. And so now suddenly you are the person who is sinning because you're holding up accountability. That somebody's plucking this one verse and saying, but this. And so now suddenly they're casting that sin back on you. And I think that happens a lot of times in these cultures where submission is emphasized so much, because then if you went out on a limb and you challenge someone and that gets thrown back at you, you're not taught to volley it back. Like, you've already stepped out of line once, you've been warned, and now I've thrown a scripture at you, and now you need to get back in line, or else you are sinning because now you are out of the hierarchy of authority or the umbrella of authority, or, whatever image is being used there. And so again, it's that it's projection that you are then putting that back onto the other person rather than accepting any accountability yourself. And it's comfortable for abusers. We know that abusers abuse because it works.
Right. And they appreciate a system that protects them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it happens a lot that within the culture of religion, the perpetrator is protected, not the victim. And that's really something to look at, that I think not enough people really look at, to see how something really needs to be changed here, because that shouldn't ever be the case, but it is in a repeated way,
And that's something. So in one of the chapters, which is control through a power imbalance, I look at a number of examples of situations where people would say, well, if we held this person accountable, it would look bad for the church. And so then the victim is cast aside and the abuser is protected under the umbrella of, we're protecting God's reputation. How insanely broken and backwards is that? Something that I say in Gaslighted by God is, we shouldn't have to lie to be good Christians. And like, God isn't looking for PR agents, right? Like, we're not supposed to go out and spin the truth, spin the message of God, but that's what happens. And then people who want to protect the system, who have something at stake that could be lost here, defend the person under the guise of something noble. Well, I'm defending the church. Okay, but in defending the church, you are choosing to protect an abuser. When is God ever against the destitute? When is God ever against the victim? Like, you are not showing the heart of God there. But we see it happen over and over and over again.
Yes. Yes. And I think to say to someone who's potentially being mistreated, that they're responsible. They're responsible for it, and they're responsible for the church, and they're responsible for God's reputation and all of it. Yeah, God's doing fine.
Yeah. Right.
Right. Hey, Jesus, good. You know what? He's done well. But I do think that then it so often happens that people just don't know that there's something they could be getting, where people could be responsible to them, and that people could care about their experience of it. I think also about that, the coldness of that thought terminating cliche, like, well, this, like the right away, the response that is just so shut down. I think a lot of people will talk to me about, even though I'm not saying that people should leave if they're involved, but I think of 12-step programs where there are these, expressions and idioms and responses that sometimes are thrown at you without you getting the sense that someone heard you or someone cares about your experience. But it's just, well, that happens because of this. And if you do that. And then the person who's participated in responding that way, I think, thinks that they gave you this tasty morsel of something really helpful, but I think it left you feeling very much alone and not heard, not really understood.
Going back again to Gaslighted by God, that actually gets to two different points that I discussed there. One being that we love to quote scripture at people And, there's a difference between quoting something to and quoting something at. And that a lot of times we like to slap scripture as if it's like a Band-Aid, and that what somebody's like the pain in their soul is just, a spiritual paper cut. And we just put something on it. So that's one thing of, like we love those easy answers because they don't require us to get into deeper nuanced thinking or to wrestle with uncomfortable issues that maybe are not really clear and cut and dry. But the other point I wanted to hit on, going back to what you said about people having their abuse put back on themselves, is that we've been taught so much to avoid a victim mindset that many people don't even recognize when they're being abused as a result, because you've been conditioned, don't be a victim, have a better mindset, pull yourself out of victim thinking. But what that does is that programs people to then not be able to recognize when they are being victimized, when they are being abused. So yes, it is important to consider overcoming a victim mindset, but sometimes people really are victims. And we need to acknowledge that and minister to them and listen to them when that's real.
It's real. Yeah. It's interesting too, because then I think about that. Then if there's no victim, there's no perpetrator.
Absolutely. That's a great point.
Right. So it's just like absolution for the person who has wronged you, that they didn't do anything wrong. Otherwise, you would have been the victim. Oh my goodness. Gaslighting, right? It's amazing. It's truly amazing. God, it gets really in depth about how much certain systems are self-protecting, and that you don't realize it when you're in it, that it's preserving itself, which can feel ultimately very selfish. So, oh my goodness, it was so good to speak with you. So let people know where they can find your plethora of wonderfulness that's out in the world.
Yeah. So you can go to my website, TiffanyYeckeBrooks.com. Yecke is spelled Yecke. You can find links to my books there. I also have a Substack, just a monthly newsletter. It's free. It's called the Leros Project. And we discuss a lot of these topics in sort of kind of lighthearted, humorous, sarcastic ways. You can find me on Facebook, Tiffany Yecke Brooks, Ph.D. And then the book, Holy Ghosted, you can get it at, your local brick and mortar store, bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, any place fine books are sold, as they say, but it's called Holy Ghosted, Spiritual Anxiety, Religious Trauma, and the Language of Abuse. And then the one that came out in 22 is called Gaslighted by God, Reconstructing a Disillusioned Faith. And those are the two books that I've written in this space. And I have other ones that you can explore if you're interested. But thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's a great conversation.
My total pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and for all the work that you have done and all the information that's out there that you've provided for countless people. Really, it's wonderful. One more thing before you go. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for our conversation today. It is so powerful to hear you talk about the research that you've done and the things that you've brought to light through your writing. And it is so interesting when I'm talking to people and I hear these recurring themes. And one of the recurring themes that stood out to me when Tiffany was talking to me was this idea of spiritual sleight of hand. This idea that somehow you're being tricked, you're being fooled, that something's happening right in front of you and you're made to not notice what you really need to notice. So many people within controlling relationships, within cultic groups, will say that they just didn't notice what they needed to notice. They didn't notice the deception. They didn't notice that the people they were dealing with didn't care about them. They thought they did. And they just didn't notice that someone might have been a sociopath or a psychopath. They just were made to gaslight themselves. really not see. Because then if you could stay in the dark, then you can keep the magic going back to sleight of hand. You can really have your heart guide you to want to keep blinders on because of the things that you were promised, the things you told could come true if you remained. Well, you can't turn back now. You don't want to see that maybe it was all false. Maybe these people are lying to you. Maybe you're not going to be receiving anything that is so special here. Well, one of the ways that happens to be very powerful when you have people you really want to remain blind to what's happening is you do what Tiffany was talking about, which is that you shame the intuition out of people. And what's important about intuition is that sometimes it's our first guide. It is the thing that talks to us. It's the part of us that sometimes comes from our wiring, sometimes comes from past experiences, where we collect the data around us. Like, if you've walked into a place and you just get kind of a bad feeling, or you meet someone and you also get kind of a bad feeling. And you might not even be able to put words to it. You just feel it. You just sense it. You just know it. That sense, that intuition that can guide you is very powerful. And that's why people trying to control you want you to believe that it is your enemy, not your friend. They want you to believe that it is misguiding you instead of guiding you. And when you use your intuition, when you follow your own instincts, they will tell you you're making a huge mistake, whether or not you are. The reason that they try to convince you that you're making a huge mistake by following your instincts and your intuition is because they want you to be dependent on them to guide you, to know what decisions you should make, how you should feel about anything, how you should feel about yourself. That inner voice is very powerful, and the people around you are going to make sure that you don't hear it as loudly anymore or hear it at all. It is also important when we talk about these kinds of, techniques of shaming the intuition out of people, learning how to gaslight yourself, doing this spiritual sleight of hand, that one of the things that can cause all of this to be able to be successful, unfortunately, is that you want people within these environments to be very dismissive of their doubts, of their questions. If you can quiet that critical eye in your mind, then you can not feel conflicted. You can feel like, oh, this is actually not so bad. Or I'm sure it's going to make sense at some point if I just believe enough, if I just follow it for long enough. One of the phrases that Tiffany used was aggressive evangelism to help the person get resolved about their own doubts. And I think one of the things that we can talk about getting resolved about your own doubts is that when someone is controlling you, they're not wanting you to be resolved about your doubts. They're wanting you to see resolution as dismissal, as ignoring, as disagreeing with. That's how you resolve the internal conflict. You just choose to not have it anymore. You choose to not see what you need to see. So when we talk about healing from these experiences, part of what needs to happen is you need to learn to see. You need to learn to see what happened to you, the times that you were lied to, the times that you really did have good intuition that was going to guide you well, and in retrospect was kind of showing you who you could trust and who you couldn't, and who you could be safe with and feel safe with and who you couldn't. That's not to say that intuition is always 100% correct, but someone's intuition, someone's sense of things is more often than not going to be more accurate than somebody else's about you. So if someone comes in and says, no, that's not how you're really feeling. No, that's not what you really think. The chance of them being right is very small, especially if they really don't know you and they really don't care about getting to know you, because it doesn't really matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what you find reprehensible, what you believe in, what you agree with, what you don't. They're more focused on shaping you into being the person that they have decided you need to be. And so in that space, there's no room for them to get to know you because, again, it simply doesn't matter. I want for all of you to always be in situations where your core matters, where who you are and what you think and what you believe and what is wrong to you and what is right to you matters. And if someone just approaches you with sort of a spiritual, but, believe this and think this, then really what they're saying is you don't count. The only way you do count is by being counted as one of the many, because a lot of these groups like a lot of members. And the only way you're going to count too is by how much you are sacrificing yourself to become this new person. But really, ultimately, that is a conditional relationship. That's not really counting as a human being. When you matter, when you count, you'll feel it. You'll know it. You'll see that someone is actually looking at you in the eye, and you'll feel seen. You'll feel heard. You'll feel safe. But I've never heard that as a truism about these environments. People will often say, I feel like I was able to be acceptable and I was able to be liked when I pretended to be something else successfully. So again, that's not being seen. That is sort of your outward persona, your outward representative being seen. That's never really the core of you. The core of you matters. And it's often speaking to you. And it's so important that you listen. And it's so important that you stay away from people who tell you to not listen to it, to not pay attention to it, to not trust it. That's taking away your safety net, which no one has the right to do. Talk to you next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.